I'm Mark Graham, the Executive Director of Virginia Highlands Small Business Incubator, and we're pleased to bring you this edition of Noon Knowledge. Today, we're going to be talking about nonprofit board governance and why it can be challenging. We have with us Cindy Colson. She is Deputy Director of Partnerships and Consulting at the Center for Nonprofit Excellence, where she oversees the development and delivery of a wide range of programs and services all across Virginia. With extensive experience in nonprofit leadership, Cindy specializes in executive leadership development and board governance training. She works closely with nonprofits to foster governance and programmatic practices that are relevant, responsive, culturally informed, and ethically grounded. And her efforts to advance CNE's mission to create equitable, thriving, and just communities are driven by strong and healthy nonprofit organizations. Cindy earned her BIS degree from the University of Virginia and an MBA from the University of Mary Washington. So we're pleased to welcome Cindy Colson. I think she's coming to us today from Suffolk. So we appreciate her joining us today, and welcome to Noon Knowledge.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to see people who are here on the Zoom with us. So just a little bit about myself beyond what Mark described. Thank you very much for the great intro, Mark. I also wanted just to share that the way that I approach any kind of content is I do not consider myself a trainer, and I'm definitely not a lecturer. I consider myself a facilitator and a provocateur. So my goal today is to be presenting some information and then for us to have some conversations. There's going to be some give and take. So about 10 to 15 minutes of our time, maybe as much as 20, is going to be me sharing content, but then the rest of it is really us sharing and diving into it and learning together in that space. So let me actually share my screen so I can hop into some of the content I want to talk about. As Mark said, I'm part of the Center for Nonprofit Excellence. I've been there for 12 years. Prior to that, I was an executive director for 15 years. And was serving on boards during that time, and I continue to serve on boards. And my niche area is really around executive leadership and board governance. And to understand the work of CNE is to understand that we truly believe that nonprofits are instrumental to the quality of life in every community. And the stronger, more robust, more just, more equitable those nonprofits, the stronger, more robust, more equitable, more just those communities. So we exist to strengthen all aspects of nonprofit management. We do that by being a champion, by being a learning partner, by being an advisor. We are on the journey with nonprofits. We are a nonprofit ourselves. So the way I talk about it is I say, we're a partner practitioner. So whatever you're going through, we have or will go through it. So we're in this with you in the work you're doing in this space. During our time together, I want to deepen our understanding of why nonprofit governance can be challenging. And as I said, I've been doing this work for 12 years, so this isn't new to me, obviously. We get lots of challenges that come to us about, how do we do this? This just happened last night at the board meeting. What do we do now? And it wasn't until just the other week that I came across this article that really synthesized this information. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm totally going to take this and start sharing this information. And it really dove down into the 3 discomforts that's described, 1 dangerous comfort area that we have as a nonprofit. And then we're going to talk about some strategies. And this all came from this article written by Andrew Taylor, titled The Weird, this is even hard to say, The Weird World of Nonprofit Governance. And I can't believe this was written in 2022 and it just landed in my lap the other week. Because I'm like, I should have been reading this years ago. So I'm imparting this to you. Here's a link to this article so you can dive into this a little bit fuller once you get the slide presentation. When we talk about the nonprofit corporate structure, we do need to put it in the larger context in which it exists. We do not, as nonprofits, exist in isolation. We are part of a much bigger ecosystem. And it's composed of 3 sectors. So we have the private sector, which is our for-profits that are privately owned. We exist with the public sector, which is for what exists for our common good. And the way that we have voice in that is through our voting and our political process is how we participate in that work. And then we have the nonprofit space, which is what we're talking about today, which is cause-driven or mission-driven. And this is where we have a governing board who actually represents and serves the public trust of those in the community. And every community looks different into what they need. Nonprofits exist because there's some gap, there's some inequity, there's something that doesn't exist for the community. And a nonprofit steps in to fill that gap. That's why there are different nonprofits in different communities where we exist. Before I dive into the challenges, I need to be sure we're all on the same page of what it means to serve on a board. What you see there on the right in that box, these are your 3 legal duties of each individual board member. So when you step on a board, you are required to fulfill your duty of care, your duty of loyalty, and your duty of obedience. So duty of care means that you are attentive to what's happening in the organization. You're reading information as it comes to you. You're participating in board meetings. You're participating in other expectations around the work of the organization. You have your duty of loyalty, which means you're putting the organization before any personal or professional gains with that. Some organizations will actually have like a conflict of interest statement that they'll ask board members to fill. Doesn't mean that you don't have a conflict, because you may have a conflict of interest. So for example, I was executive director at Culpeper Regional Hospital Foundation. I had physicians who owned one of the buildings in which we ran some of our services out of. Whenever we were having conversations or making decisions around what would be happening in that building, those physicians, those board members had to recuse themselves from that conversation. They had a conflict of interest. They recused themselves from that conversation, and then they came back in once the decisions had been made. We needed to be sure that we were upholding their duty of loyalty to the organization. And then the third legal duty that you have as an individual board member is your duty of obedience, meaning that you are ensuring that the organization is compliant with any federal, state, local regulations, laws that exist, your bylaws, which is your governing document as an organization, and any other kinds of regulations or guidelines or restrictions that might come with grants that you might receive. As a board member, you're ensuring that you're in compliance in that space. So those are your legal duties as an individual board. But then we put all of these individuals together in a room, and then they have this work that they have to do, which are under those umbrellas that you see in that graphic. So under those umbrellas, you have to establish the organization's identity. The board is responsible for ensuring that there are resources, and they're also responsible for providing oversight. That's what we do as a collective in this work. So legal duties individual, then the 3 roles: organizational identity, ensuring resources, and providing oversight. There. So where did the discomforts come in? We're like, oh, this looks pretty straightforward. This seems pretty simple, Cindy. Why would this be a challenge in nonprofit work? Well, here's where it starts. It starts with collective leadership. We put incredible, dynamic, brilliant leaders on our board who are leaders in their own right, who are very vocal, lead incredible teams. And then we put them in a room together and we say, why can't we all work together as a team? And here is what we've discovered. On a nonprofit board, it's not to make decisions in a team, but as a team. And many times the leaders that are coming onto our board have certainly led teams and have been part of teams, but may not have actually been part of collective leadership, where you actually have to collectively decide as a team where you're going to be going forward in this work, not as a single team member or as the leader of the team member, but as a collective team. So there are some structures in place that actually help us to kind of disrupt our natural tendency to think as an individual, which, by the way, is culturally the norm in the United States. We are definitely driven as individuals. We talk about getting ourselves up by our bootstraps, like all of this is individually driven. And then again, we're putting them in a room where we work as a collective. So what are some disruptors that we naturally have to counter this? Is around board chair. So the board chair has a role as a facilitator to ensure that everyone is participating, everyone has equal voice, there's time on the agenda for the conversation that we need to have. There's Robert's rules or some structure that you have as a nonprofit that talks about how do we make decisions as a collective group. There's some process in place, not just whoever speaks first, whoever speaks loudest. We have a process in our decision-making around collective leadership. And then there's one voice. Once the board votes and makes a decision, that is the decision. Doesn't matter what me, Cindy, as an individual thought, shared, or voted for. Once that vote as a board has been taken and the decision's been made, that is the voice I carry forward as a voice of the board. So it comes up against this individual culture that we have, that we need to be working as a collective whole. So that's the first challenge that we have. And then we have as nonprofits, who do we work for? Who are we accountable to in the work that we do? So I'm actually going to ask, and Mark, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask if people want to share, if they'll voice this or if they'll put it in the chat with what their understanding is around who are we accountable to as a nonprofit and who are we responsible to in our nonprofit work. I'm going to stop share so I can see if there are any responses. And this could either be with organizations that you're currently working with or that you have worked with, or you could just go, I think this could be true.
Cindy, I have a question.
Of
This is
course,
Cass
please.
Rasnick. Do you mean the board itself or the organization?
Thank you for the distinction, because I'm referring to the board itself. Because when we talk about organization, many times we can be talking about staff, and the staff is actually accountable to the board. So thank you for that clarifying question. That's great.
Yeah, in that case, I think there is some shared accountability from the board for the staff, that they hold us accountable for following through on what we said we would do to support them and making sure we're meeting our mission, but also to the people we serve in our community.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. So there were two different constituents that you just mentioned there. One is if the organization has staff, the board needs to be sure that the staff is holding the board accountable for the work that they need to be doing. Some organizations will do that informally. So they'll have just kind of an informal kind of check-in. How are things going? How are we progressing? There may be a plan that's in place. So it's kind of how are we moving in the direction of what our plan has for us. Some have a more formal structure where they'll actually assess, some sort of tool that they'll do, perhaps annually or every 2 years, where the board is actually assessing how are we collectively working towards the impact we say that we want to have in the community. And staff participate in that process as well with that. And then the other constituency that you mentioned is the community that we serve. Like, how do we know we exist because we're creating this change in the community, but how do we know that that's is actually the change the community wants, needs? And then how is it that we get feedback over time? Because remember, we're part of a bigger ecosystem. It's not static. Things change. How do we have this ongoing feedback from the community we're serving that indeed we're continuing to have the impact that we want to have? Great. The other thing that I will mention, and let me pull up my slide here again, because I'll talk about this too. We'll hear this term fiduciary, which is a legal term. And if you're not familiar with it, many organizations or individuals interpret this to mean finance. Well, that's one aspect of being fiduciary, but the true meaning of fiduciary means we act on behalf of and in the best interest of another. So how we manage our resources is certainly part of that, but not exclusively. It's all aspects of our work. How are we ensuring that we're doing it in the best interest of and on behalf of whoever we are serving in that space? Just being sure that we get feedback from those that we serve. So that can be a little tricky. So if an organization doesn't have a mechanism to be sure they're getting that feedback from the staff, from those they're serving, I would even argue even some key partnerships, because many partnerships exist so that we can actually execute on our mission. And I'll give you a great example, the Center for Nonprofit Excellence. We are so honored to have a partnership with Wellspring Foundation that actually allows us to have a physical presence there in Southwest Virginia. I have my colleague, Jess Campbell Harmon, who's a full-time team member of the Center for Nonprofit Excellence, who has office space at Wellspring. So as I'm talking about these things and we're diving into this content, you can actually reach out at any point to Jess for some follow-up information and resources, because we have a presence there through our partnership. So part of our checking in with our constituents and being sure we're held accountable and responsible too is checking in with our partners. Are we doing with what we said we were going to do in response to our partnership that we have? And then the third piece, so we've got the one is the collective leadership. Many of us aren't trained in that. We come up as individual leaders. We're put in a boardroom, expected to understand it. We need to be trained in that space. We need to understand who we're accountable to and for. And then we have this life cycle, and we have the organization and we have the board life cycle. So let me first talk about the organizational life cycle. Every organization has a life cycle. It's portrayed here as linear. It's not linear. So we can spiral up. We can go from our idea startup phase We can reach up to decline to maturity, then something will happen. Can I just mention March 2020 took us all into a tailspin, and then we spun back into a different area. We might have gone into an idea phase for some of our programs because we had to totally revamp what we'd been doing. Some of us in March of 2020 actually saw exponential growth in where we needed to be doing. So we may have been in that mature phase, then we're back into growth. All of this to say where an organization is and the work it's doing looks really different depending on where it is in its life cycle. This is also true for board service and what we need around governance. And again, this is shown linearly. It's not linear in general. What we do always share in governance is this organization and founding boards. This is what actually launches us. And this usually starts in a couple different ways. It's either a group of individuals who've gotten together and said, this is a gap, this is a need in our community, we need to address this. Or sometimes it might be an individual who has led the charge on this. But either way, there's this organizing time of either a leader or a group of leaders who are coming together to address a need in the community. As that organization progresses, if it progresses along its life cycle, at some point, the board is going to switch from being really high touch to moving more into infrastructure. So let me show you how this works in the flow chart here. Generally, your organizing and founding boards are really in that idea and startup phase. As we're moving into that startup phase, we're starting to see where boards are moving more into the governing board, and we'll talk about that. And then usually somewhere around that growth phase and definitely into our mature phase, we'll get into that institutional board. And remember, again, there might be a crisis, there might be a moment of decline. We might revert back in our organization to a different part of the life cycle, which means we may need a different kind of board, depending on where we are in our life cycle, to make that happen. So how do these different boards look different along that life cycle? So in this first stage, as I said, this is where we usually have either a group of individuals or an individual who's identified a need in the community. And this is high touch work. This is what we would usually call a working board. The board members are all hands-on, day-to-day, making sure everything's happening with the organization. That's what's happening at this stage of the life cycle. When we get to this next stage of the life cycle, this is where we're starting to identify, we're actually needing to create some infrastructure in our work. We need to actually be sure that we're engaging with the community that we're serving, that we have some processes in place. We may still be doing some of that day to day, but we're developing some infrastructure around our work, some consistency, some continuity, some policies, some procedures. At that point, we've now migrated into the governing board. And for some organizations, when they get to the place where they're actually fully staffed, they actually are paying for professionals to execute on the work, the board can actually step back into this institutional board space where they are really in that work of defining policy. They need to make sure the resources are there for the organization. Yes, that's money, but it's also ensuring that we're hiring the right executive director, that we're being sure we're retaining our reputational capital, that we're building the board based on what we need in that space, and that all of that is there to ensure we're fulfilling the mission. And we're imparting that to our staff who are executing on that. So this is a question that I have for you guys. And again, this could be with an organization that you're currently working with, or that you have worked with, or you're just theorizing. What have been some of your experiences around challenges, either in the collective leadership space, or in who are we accountable to, like who do we work for, or in the board life cycle? Just some thoughts that you might have around those three areas that are really kind of areas of challenges for nonprofits. Oh, I have something here in chat. Okay. Board trying to micromanage the day-to-day. Oh, yes, yes. We see that so much, especially in that life cycle where we're transitioning from that idea phase into where we're actually moving into we're needing some infrastructure. And sometimes that's really hard for board members to let go, because if they've been involved in that day-to-day work, and now they've got staff and they're like, but that's my program. That's the work I've been doing. It can be a really hard transition. Hiring of staff is a really key time in a nonprofit, that transition from all board to having some staff. And boards need to be educated, given the opportunity to understand how that shifts for them. Thank you, Mark. That's a great one. Oh, board and consistency engagement. Yes. So here's some thoughts I have around this, and I'd love to get your all's thinking on this. I have many, and this is primarily I hear from board chairs and executive directors, that 20% of the board is doing 80% of the work. So I kind of push against that, and I want to get your all's take on this. I'm wondering sometimes if it's the perceived work. Not saying that this doesn't hold true. I do believe that there's a smaller percentage that does the most of it. But are we expecting the same level of engagement for every single board member to be engaged in? Or are we asking board members to come and bring what they do really well, whether that's connections to our in-kind contributions, or the way that they relate to other people in the community, the way they can open doors, whatever that might be. Maybe it looks different. Maybe the most visible work of the board members is definitely ready. It's apparent, it's visible. But then if I have board members that I can call and I know they will act promptly when I ask them to work, is that not also valuable in its own way? I don't know. I'm kind of posing the question.
Yeah, I definitely think it is valuable. And I think we're developing right now with the board I work with a board member skill matrix. So our team kind of knows who to call for what. I guess my question, or not really question, but one of the challenges we're facing is a member of our board in leadership comes in really hot and then disappears off the face of the earth for 6 weeks. And so every time our staff talks to him, it's, I've got 50 new ideas, da 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 da, get going on this. And then, there's no kind of follow up. And he gets frustrated because his ideas aren't implemented, but, he spends kind of a short period of time really engaged with them and thinking about how they might actually be implemented along with the rest of our work, if that makes sense.
Oh, it totally does. It totally does. So here's a tool that could possibly be helpful. I welcome your feedback on this. I think this is where having a plan for what you're going to work on in the upcoming year, whatever that might be. Some organizations have what they call a strategic plan where they're looking 3 years out. Some organizations have an operational plan that says, in this year, these are our 3 things. What I love about plans is when we have board members who are coming in all excited, all jazzed, because they had just been to this conference or they had just seen this nonprofit who did this and said, we should be doing this. What it does, it allows us to say, well, let's just reflect. This is what we said our priorities are for the year. If this rates to the caliber of where we need to be doing it this year, what are we taking off of our plate to be sure that we're making room for this implementation? The other thing, remember I talked about collective leadership? This is, again, the challenge we have, right? We have one board member with incredible ideas. One board member does not run in the nonprofit corporate structure. One board member does not run the corporation. It's a board. So the other thing is, how do we put structures in place? So when this brilliant idea comes in, and they're always brilliant, truly, they really are amazing. How do we bring that up to the board for the board then to be making some decisions? And again, the board should be approving what the organization's working towards that year. And when this idea comes up, then how is it that we integrate that into the plan? What do we jettison out of the plan? How do we say that is so important, but we're not able to do it this year? We're going to make sure that happens next year. But we have to work the board to where they're actually starting to work as a collective. Again, this is the challenge, right? They have to work as a collective, not just one individual board member with that. Thank you. All right, I'm going to go back and share screen. Jump in, please, anytime with other ideas or challenges that you might have. Remember, I'm not provocateur, I'm the facilitator with our time together. So let me go into this dangerous comfort. Okay, so we talked about where we have some discomfort, collective leadership. We have some discomfort around the board and organizational life cycle. Where is it that we have some dangerous comfort? And this is where it is. In the nonprofit corporate structure, we are a self-perpetuating board. So what does that mean? So that means board members get to decide who they're going to put on the board with them. So what does that look like? And I love this. I pulled this directly from the article because I think Andrew did a great job. He goes, and that's the trap of comfort for governing boards, because so often when they look into the world for new members, they look for people like them. They look for people who are already connected through social networks or professional networks, who are similarly situated in wealth and power and influence. And so often that becomes a monochromatic board by every definition of that term, because we're looking for someone just like me to replace myself on the board. So that feels comfortable, right? But there are challenges when we do that. Remember, we are not owned by an individual. We are owned by the community. And if we all are monochromatic, we know communities are not monochromatic. We have different levels of ability. We have different ages. We have different genders, you name it. We are different. So how do we have that on the board, the work that we do? To remind us where we sit, we represent, we serve the public trust. So here are some strategies I want to share with you. I don't believe board recruitment, as it's usually called. I don't think it's an activity. I think it's a process. And so at CNE, we talk about it being a pipeline. It's not uncommon for a board member or board chair to reach out to me and say, we have an opening in 3 months. Who do you know that we should bring on the board? Okay, the very first thing that tells me is they're looking for a warm body. There is nothing strategic in that at all. They just need a warm body. What we want to be working towards is not who do you know, but what. So we start with the what. What do we need on the board to execute on our mission, to reach our vision, to execute on our strategy? That's what we need on the board. And then we can get to the who. That's how we start building this pipeline. So let me tease this out a little bit. When we talk about strategic recruitment, there should be significant time that's actually spent on identifying, and that's getting into the what. I love it was mentioned that there's a metrics. I love metrics. I think metrics should be highly customized to your organization. Again, to identify the people that you serve should be on there. Age demographics, ethnicity, geographical areas, different abilities, whether they've served in the military, whatever that is, that representation, that should be in your metrics. Then you should have individual board members actually fill that out. I know some organizations will actually fill it out. Usually the executive or the board chair will fill it out on behalf of the board. I'll be honest, we did that at CNE about 2 years ago. We shared the metrics to the board, and we had a board member say, would I identify as Hispanic? We had no idea. We had no idea. So this is why it's important to actually have individual board members fill out that metrics as to how they identify and what they bring to the board in terms of perspective and lived experiences. Once we've identified what we have on the board, and we know what we need to execute on our vision, mission, and strategy, then that tells us where we have gaps. That's that identify piece. Now we've got the what. Now we start moving into the who, which is getting us into this cultivation space. So when we talk about cultivating, it's like now we've identified what, we've identified who, we bring them in closer to the organization. And that can be done in several different ways. Many organizations will have committees, and that's a great structure to have. If you have a way to bring someone in that you've identified that has some interest, there may be some alignment around values. Let's bring them into a committee to see if indeed that holds true. Some will have them invited to different kinds of events that they host. I actually always encourage before we ever make the ask for someone to sit on a board that they actually attend at least 1 or 2 board meetings, because I think it's important for them to actually see our board in action, to see how we work, what our norms are, what our culture is. That I think that's critical for their decision-making in that space. And then, believe it or not, we actually get to the ask. There's identify, cultivate, and then we recruit or we actually make the ask. And then we get to the second phase. So now we've got this incredible new board member. We've brought them on board. And now we're saying we want them to be effectively engaged. Well, there's some work we have to do to make sure that happens. First, we have to orient them to our organization. I've had board members who says, oh, I don't need to be oriented. I've served on boards. Like, you have served on boards. You have not served on this board. You have not served with this organization. There are things that are unique to what we do. And I need to be sure that there's some clarity around that and some understanding. So we need to orient board members and not just assume through osmosis, they'll pick up on what it means to be a part of a board member on this board that they've been asked to serve on. We need to get them involved. Board members should be involved in meaningful work. They want to make a difference. That's why they're giving of their time. They're truly non-renewable resource. They're giving that because they want to create change in the world in which they exist. They need to be involved in meaningful work. Where I see this sometimes falter is where organizations will have an executive committee, which we encourage in terms of practice. So if you're not familiar with the executive committee, that's usually established in your bylaws. And an executive committee in most organizations is composed of officers of the board. And those officers, per the bylaws, compose the executive committee, and they can act on behalf of the full board. There's reasons why that exists. Can I just again go back to March 2020? So for some organizations, they had to make immediate shifts, i.e., how do we conduct a board meeting when we don't have anything around virtual meetings in our bylaws? being able to convene 3 or 4 board members instead of 8 to 12 to 15 board members was a lot easier for them to make that change, that they can actually go to virtual meetings. But if we have an executive committee who's doing all the work, and then they're coming to the board meetings and saying, here, this is what we talked about, this is what we decided, there's no involvement of the other board meetings. We believe that executive committee should be very selectively used, we being CNE as a practice. And then we need to educate our board members. They need to be educated around what it means to serve on a board. Let's go back to collective leadership. Let's talk about what it means to serve on a board and how we work as a collective, not as just as a group of individuals that come together in a team as opposed to working as a team. We also need to be sure that board members are being educated about our mission area, especially if you're staff, you are living and breathing this every day. Your board may be coming in for 2 to 4 hours a month to join you in that work. So they're not going to be as entrenched in it, and they're not going to know the trends that are happening and that are changing. We need to be sure that we're keeping them abreast of that. That's part of our role as staff. If you are a working board, so remember we had that life cycle. If you are a working board, we need to be sure that there's time on the agenda and there's opportunity for board members to get that level of education of the work. And I'm not just talking about counting how many paper clips we purchased, how many pencils. I'm referring to strategy and direction in the work we're doing. So we have to orient them. We have to get them involved in meaningful work, and we have to have intentionality around educating them. If we achieve those 3 things, we actually have board members who are effectively engaged in the work. And remember, I told you this is a process. So the next thing we need to do is we need to evaluate, rotate, and celebrate. Evaluate, we've already talked about. How do we know we're having the impact that we say we want to have in the mission area that we want to be a part of? We need to actually assess that somehow. We need to be asking those questions. There are some organizations that will actually do an assessment at the end of the board meeting, and they'll just have board members who will do like a closed fist if it was great. 1, there was some area for improvement. 2, like, ugh, we really bombed this meeting. We need to reassess that. They go to that level of asking the questions, were you heard? Were you able to participate? And they do that kind of assessment at the end of the meeting. As I mentioned, some do an annual evaluation of their work. Rotate. At CNE, we are proponents of rotation of board terms. We think and believe firmly that board members should rotate off and give opportunity for new board members to come on, because we are part of an ecosystem and that system changes. There should be reflection of that on our board. There is the caveat that when you're in that founder board stage, remember we were talking about that stage of work, there is validity to wanting to keep those board members on, especially until we get to the point where we're developing some infrastructure. So it's not uncommon for us to see organizations where when they launch, there are no board terms, but once they get into that governing board phase, that's usually where board terms start to be initiated to that work. And oh my goodness, we need to celebrate board members. They give of their time. They are volunteers. We need to be sure we're acknowledging and celebrating them for what all they're giving to the organization. So the board pipeline: strategic recruitment, effective engagement, intentional revitalization. Actually, before I go to this, I'm gonna stop share. Any questions on that piece that we just talked about? And that we're just remind you, we were talking about the dangerous comfort is where board members elect board members like themselves, self-perpetuating. So Mark, here's my quick ask. I'm going to ask if we can move everyone into breakout rooms. I'm going to give the scenario, and I'm going to give you just about 5 minutes in the breakout rooms. I want you to talk about this scenario. Okay, so let me share the scenario with you. So here we are. Oops, let me go back. Sorry about that. So here, your board has some vacancies. These are the key points I want you to remember. Your board has some vacancies, and you want to be sure you're filling them before the end of the year. And your executive director's already said, well, we have some concerns that our board is not currently reflecting our community in the way that it should. Here are the candidates that's brought forward. You have a retired banker who's serving on multiple nonprofit boards. He's a friend of the treasurer. The second candidate is a longtime donor who's attended every single fundraising gala that you've held. Now, the concern is that neither one of these increase diversity, but both of them are reliable, they're well-known, and they're available. You've got a retired banker, a long-term donor. And then the third candidate that could possibly fill the seat is someone who's young, they're a community organizer, they actually work with an underserved population that's in your region. This referral came from a staff member. We do know that this candidate is passionate, they're knowledgeable, they definitely represent a different demographic, but they've never served on a board, and they would need to be mentored, and they would need to be supported. And the committee is really split. So again, a retired banker, longtime donor. We know that they're reliable, well-known, and available. And then we have this younger candidate who we don't know as much about, brings passion, but has never served on a board. So when you go into breakout rooms, here are the things I want you to talk about. What are some assumptions that we're making about this scenario? How can the board balance experience and representation? And what structures might need to be in place? So Mark, if we could just spend 5 minutes, just move them into small groups. And then if you guys can just bring 1 or 2 key things that you talked about back to the group. Now, this is what we're going to be doing. I want you guys to share, again, in chat, or if you want to come off mute and share. You've got this scenario, 3 board members. What are some things you can put in place? What are some assumptions this committee might be making, this board might be making around these candidates?
One thing I would suggest is sometimes if it's somebody you want to keep close, but maybe you need that space for other folks, as you can remember, you have advisory boards, other kinds of boards to kind of fulfill those needs.
Oh my gosh, Samantha, so many times we falter into thinking, well, we have a board and we have committees and that's the only structure we have. Oh my gosh, we do not. The nonprofit corporate structure only requires that you have a nonprofit board. And to be honest, it only requires that federally that you have 3 board members. Now, I would argue the point that's really hard to have community representation with 3 board members. But the idea is that you have incredible latitude as to how you get the work done. And advisory is definitely one of them. Some organizations will actually just have advisors. And I see this a lot of times around philanthropy and fundraising. So there might be a couple of key individuals in the community who are really connected, are exceptional philanthropists. They cannot serve on every nonprofit board. They just can't. But what they might be willing to do is to spend maybe an hour twice a year with you to talk to you about some ideas around the strategy that you've presented to them. And maybe at the end of the year for you to review, like, this is the strategy we implemented. Here are some challenges. Here are some hiccups. What thoughts do you have as we refine it for the next year? They might come in as an advisor. Oh my gosh, absolutely. Thank you for that.
I think since there's 3 open seats, you can consider pairing the less experienced person with another one of the more experienced people in kind of like a class-like pairing. So, okay, this is the class of 2025. You're our new board members. You develop a special relationship and they can teach each other.
Oh my gosh, I was right. They can come in as a class. The other thing that I've heard about, I love that. I love that they're coming in as a unit and they can be supportive. I've also heard organizations do what they call board mentors or board buddies, where new board members are actually assigned a mentor or board buddy of a current board member. And some of the tasks that mentor or board buddies asked is be sure you're connecting with the incoming board member before they come, that you facilitate an introduction with them so that they're actually not having to introduce themselves, that I'm introducing, let's say I'm introducing you, Hope. I'm going to introduce you at the board meeting. I had lunch with you. I know this. So I'm introducing Hope as a multidimensional person. I know she has this interest. I know she lives here. We're excited that she's going to bring this kind of representation because she lives in this part of the community, whatever it might be, I'm introducing. And then the other thing that I see organizations ask mentors or board buddies to do is to check in at least the first 3 meetings after the board meeting with their mentee or board buddy. And the reason is because things are going to come up that new board member will probably never ask questions about in those first meetings. And it's almost always around finance. So board members, especially new ones, are not going to ask questions around what did that report really say that I just voted in support of? Like, help me to understand that. And having that board buddy allows that safe space for those conversations to take place. Yes, love those ideas. Thank you. Let me go back and share the screen. So we talked about board buddies. We talked about bringing them in as a class. So they're not just singled out, but they're actually coming in as a cohort into the board in that space. Love those.
Cindy?
Yes, please.
Having served on effective boards and non-effective boards, I think one of the things that is really good for every board, no matter how long people have been on the board or not, is to kind of educate the whole board as to what is a good board. I think there's like varying degrees of understanding on what that is. And the reason I'm on this is because I've been on other boards, but I'm getting ready to go on to 2 new ones. And so I was like, you know what? This will be good to just get a refresher here. And because I think there's like what you said, I immediately wrote down what you said about how the feds only require 3 members on a board. There's this prevailing belief that you need like 40 people on a board, or I mean, I think the prevailing belief you need 12 or something, but I've always thought that you don't need that many people. And I have been on boards that had too many people on there so that you got nothing done. And they all thought everything had to be done by consensus. And I'm like, if you've got 18 people on a board, you're never going to get anything done. It's a popularity contest. And then you go into that comfort feeling that you were talking about. So I really like that there's some education here as to what is a good board and that you're talking about, because I just don't think board members or boards in general talk about that. So I think it's funny that, they needed 3 slots, that 3 people were put forward, but only 1 really fit the bill. So it's like, did they really buy into what would make the board stronger, or were they just trying to find a buddy? So I really appreciate you talking about what is a good board.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And thank you for just pointing out, right? The other 2 were really warm bodies, right? Because what was the description? They were well known, they were available, didn't talk about who they represented, didn't talk about the different demographic. Yes, absolutely. And I would also want to just comment about when we talk about the board structure, again, federally required to have 3. Your bylaws need to reference bylaws, because your bylaws should definitely tell you how many board members you need to have on the board. Some organizations will have a minimum. There should be a maximum. Some, if you're quasi-government, so if you're a community action agency, some of them have a little bit more structure around representation. So you have to have so many like elected officials or so many community members, so much of that. Look at your bylaws, see what your bylaws say around how many board members you need to have. And I think it's worth the question of saying, is this the right number for us? The other thing that you brought up is where the work happens. Work should not be happening at the board meeting. When you get to that point in your life cycle, now that means we're moving beyond being a working board. We're not in that idea phase. Once we get to the governing board phase, that work should not be happening at a board meeting. That should be happening in whatever that structure is. And many of us have committees. That should be happening at the committee level. And then any questions that arise from that committee, that's what should be coming up to the board meeting. That meaningful work should be happening in the committees. Meaningful questions come up to the board. So they're doing that governance work. Unless you're a working board. There's always little caveats. But if you're a working board, even then, it might be happening at the board meeting, but you need to know which hat you're wearing. If you're doing day-to-day, you're wearing the management work. That's on the agenda for that. And then you have the governance work. You don't negate governance work when you're a working board. You just need to be clear of which hat you're wearing at those times. Thank you. So as a reminder, this is where we're uncomfortable. Collective leadership. We put brilliant people in the room and magically think they should know how to work together. We need to spend some time in our orientation and onboarding and expectations around what it means to be a collective, what it means to have one voice. That's the other little thing I say with organizations. I really have a challenge when there are parking lot conversations after the board meeting. Once the board meeting's done, the decision's been made, that's it. If I feel so strongly in disagreement with what the board has decided, I need to step away from that board. It's one voice. I get to say my piece, but once it's decided, I support that. And if I feel strongly against it, then that's not the right organization for me. Some discomfort around accountability. We need to be sure that we understand and have clarity and are getting feedback from those that we're accountable to, which is the community. Now, we'll say in terms of the legal structure, we are accountable to the state attorney general, but you will be tried in the court of public opinion way before it ever gets to the state attorney general. We talked about the board life cycle, the importance of knowing where you are in the life cycle in terms of the organization and in terms of the board, knowing that's not linear, and then that our dangerous comfort levels around being self-perpetuating, that we will continue to look for people who look, feel, are just like us, and when we become monochromatic, which means we're not serving the community with that. Any questions that you all have around the content that I've shared?
Hey, Cindy, this is Cass again. I'm wondering if you have any strategies that you all could recommend for recruiting board members outside of our networks, because obviously we can only ask people that we know already. But would love to hear about something that's been successful for y'all.
Absolutely. So the biggest thing is you can still go through your networks, but remember when you're going through your networks, you're going for the what, not the who. So your networks are going to become much more defined when they're making the ask with that. There are some organizations that will actually put stuff out there in social media that will just say, we are looking for a board member. And this is, again, the what we're looking for. The United Way locally, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the United Way has a volunteer platform. I know they've been very involved with disaster awareness, appropriately so, but I think they have a volunteer platform. So that volunteer platform, we want to be sure that we're leveraging with that as well. And then if you are really looking for diversity, so if you're looking for someone, let's just say in Grayson County. So Grayson County, I know is far out, right? So we would actually need to perhaps go to places where people in Grayson County actually go. Like, how do we meet people in that community? We should not expect that board members will automatically come to us. If we are trying to read a target audience that we do not have connections directly with, or even 2 or 3 times removed, we need to be much more proactive in going into those spaces where they actually are and building trust. Collaboration happens at the pace of trust. So we need to start building that trust to make that happen. So all of that to say, Cassie, don't expect an immediate response if it's a community that you don't have immediate ties with. But it's how do we build a strategy, build that pipeline to get us there. Any other questions that you all might have? You will definitely receive these slides. Mark, if you don't mind, I want to be sure when we send this out that we also include Jess's contact information. I'll email that to you so that as you guys are pondering this information and thinking about it, you can reach out to Jess, who's my colleague that's there in Abington, and she can provide additional resources for you.
Yes, we can do that.
Wonderful. Thank you. So that's what I have. But again, I'm open to questions and comments. And then Mark, I didn't know if there was any announcements that you need to make.
I'll be happy to wrap up, but we'll see if anybody has any other questions. Good presentation.
Remember, I'm a facilitator. Present your questions is what I love. Yes.
This is Jean. I just wanted to also make a comment that Jess has been great. She actually has had several meetings in our facility here. So I will pass along people that registered for this and give her those names too, so she can invite those for her future meetings.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jean.
Okay.
Oh, I have a question. Can you provide the services that CNA provides? Ooh, yes. Oh, give us a little pitch. I love that. I can give a pitch. So the way that we do our work, we certainly do trainings. So you'll see some training announcements that come out. If you're not getting our newsletter, we want to be sure we get you on our newsletter. I, by far, think the greatest value that we do is around technical assistance, one-on-one advising. You can call us with any question that you have. It could be, oh my God, the board chair did this last night. How am I supposed to respond? Do you have a template around this? We are hiring our first executive director. What's the salary that we're seeing in our community? We are considering a partnership. Which are some of the things that we should be thinking about around this partnership? We are thinking about maybe even merging some programs, which it can be anything around nonprofit governance. Bear in mind, we do not have expertise in mission area. I can't answer questions about early childhood or emergency services or food insecurity, but anything around strategy, finance, HR, governance, any of that infrastructure piece that we need to operate our nonprofits, we are curating all the time. We have resources available to you. Reach out to us. I like to say, don't Google. If you have this impulse to start searching for something, I need you to stop and email Jess, because that's what Jess does. That's how she helps to create capacity for you, because she knows where to find the information and she can get that right to you. But that's how we help to support nonprofits. And we also just keep abreast of what's happening. There's lots of shifts that's happening with different kinds of executive orders. That's not uncommon. Every administration, there are shifts every time. It is happening pretty quickly, and some of it's very targeted to nonprofits. So we're also keeping abreast of what's happening in that space so that nonprofits can keep informed. We know that nonprofits must stay very focused. They have a mission they're trying to achieve. Our role is more in that larger picture of the ecosystem and being sure that nonprofits are kept abreast of what's happening in that space as well.
Well, this has all been very helpful. Cindy, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody on the call. You know, I've been involved in nonprofit board governance for over 3 decades, and I wish somebody had sat me down like you did early on, so I didn't have to learn all this by trial by fire, you know. But a lot of good points and good tips in there that and best practices. You know, we've all got to be involved in building stronger communities, because if we aren't doing it, nobody's going to do it. And you know, it's really quintessential Americana. You know, we've got to build these communities, and nonprofits are doing good work out here every day. So thanks for what you are doing, Cindy, and what everybody else is doing, and keep up the good work. So we'll be happy to obviously post this to our YouTube channel for Noon Knowledge soon, but you can also look on there for other topics of interest that any of you might have. There's a whole list going back to 2014. We need to call that list a little bit, but all sorts of great programs on there, like the one for today, in a wide variety of topics for startup businesses and existing businesses. If you have ideas for programs, we're always happy to listen to those. Let us know here at Virginia Highlands Small Business Incubator. And as always, thanks for our to our partners here at the Small Business Incubator, the town of Abingdon, and the Washington County Chamber of Commerce. This will be our last Noon Knowledge until the fall. We usually take a summer break, and we'll be happy to do that. But again, if you have ideas for new programs in the fall, let us know about those, and watch for our programs coming up this fall. But Cindy, thank you for that very informative program. Thanks everybody for joining us, and have a good weekend.
Thanks. Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.